Some cases do not begin with noise or chaos. They begin with silence, an ordinary night, a routine drive, a young person who does not come home. At first, nothing looks alarming. No broken glass, no blood, no witnesses running to police, just absence. And when absence stretches past hours, then days, it starts to weigh on everyone left behind. In western North Carolina, one disappearance would sit unanswered for decades. The name stayed in records, the face stayed in memory, and the lack of answers became the most unsettling detail of all. If you want more stories examined carefully, without hype or shortcuts, consider subscribing. It helps keep this kind of work going. Zebb Quinn was 18 years old in January of 2000. He lived in Asheville, North Carolina with his mother. He was finishing high school and working part-time. His life followed a familiar pattern of school responsibilities, shifts at work, and plans that pointed forward rather than away. Nothing about his behavior suggested he was preparing to disappear. On the night he vanished, Zebb was driving his mother's car. He had told her he was heading out briefly and would return. That return never happened. Hours passed without contact. By morning, concern replaced routine. Friends had not heard from him. Calls went unanswered. There was no explanation that fit what was known about him. Later, the car was found abandoned in the parking lot of a local restaurant. It was unlocked. Inside, there were no signs of a struggle, no visible damage, no evidence that pointed clearly to a crime. The scene offered more questions than direction. Investigators documented the vehicle, its location, and its condition, but nothing immediately explained why it had been left there or what had happened afterward. Law enforcement initially approached the situation as a missing person case. That decision reflected the information available at the time. Zebb was legally an adult. There was no confirmed crime scene. There were no witnesses reporting violence. In situations like this, procedure matters. Without evidence of foul play, investigators are limited in how far they can go. Attention turned to Zebb's last known movements. Police worked to confirm where he had been, who he had planned to see, and what his evening had looked like. One confirmed detail was that he intended to meet someone that night. That connection narrowed the focus of early inquiries. Among those interviewed was Robert Jason Owens, a former friend and co-worker. Owens acknowledged knowing Zebb and confirmed contact that evening. He denied any involvement in the disappearance. At that stage, investigators had no physical evidence contradicting his account. Without corroboration or forensic support, suspicion alone was not enough to justify charges. Search efforts followed. Areas around Asheville were examined. Tips from the public were logged and evaluated. Each lead required verification. None produced a location, a witness, or evidence that could confirm what had happened after Zebb left in the car. Days turned into weeks. The urgency that drives early searches slowly gave way to uncertainty. The absence of proof made it difficult to escalate the investigation. Without a body, without forensic findings, and without reliable eyewitness testimony, the case could not legally move into a homicide framework. This gap between concern and certainty is where many disappearances stall. Investigators cannot act on belief, they must act on evidence. In Zebb Quinn's case, evidence was thin from the start. For his family, that reality was devastating. There was no explanation to process, no facts to accept, no closure to move toward. Every unanswered call and empty update reinforced the same truth: no one knew where he was. As months passed, the case remained open but inactive. It was not closed, it was not forgotten. It was suspended in a space where time continued, but progress did not. The file stayed on record. His name remained listed as missing, but movement slowed. The early years of the investigation would later be understood as foundational, not because they solved anything, but because they defined the limits investigators were forced to work within. What was not found in those first days shaped the next 20 years. Zebb Quinn had vanished without leaving behind the kind of trail law enforcement relies on, and in that absence, the case entered a long stretch where questions outnumbered answers, and silence became the most persistent clue. The days after Zebb Quinn disappeared were marked by steady police work rather than dramatic breakthroughs. Investigators focused on reconstructing what could be confirmed, where he went, who he contacted, what could be verified rather than assumed. Each step followed procedure because without evidence of a crime, procedure was the only tool available. Officers documented the discovery of the abandoned car in detail. Its location in a public restaurant parking lot suggested it had been left intentionally rather than hidden. The lack of damage or disturbance inside the vehicle limited what could be inferred. There were no items clearly linked to violence, no signs of forced entry, no biological traces reported that would immediately elevate the case to a criminal investigation. Attention shifted to Zebb's known activities that evening. Investigators confirmed he had planned to meet someone after leaving home. That detail narrowed the scope of early interviews. Friends, co-workers, and acquaintances were questioned to establish timelines and confirm interactions. Each interview was compared for consistency, looking for gaps or contradictions that could be tested. Robert Jason Owens was interviewed during this period. He acknowledged contact with Zebb on the night he vanished and confirmed plans to meet. Owens denied any involvement in the disappearance or harm. At that stage, investigators had no physical evidence to dispute his account. Without corroboration, statements alone could not support further action. Search efforts expanded beyond the immediate area. Law enforcement coordinated with volunteers to examine nearby locations where a vehicle or person might have gone unnoticed. These searches were methodical but constrained. Without a confirmed destination or last known point beyond the parking lot, each area examined was chosen based on probability rather than certainty. Tips from the public began to arrive. Each was logged, assessed, and followed when possible. Some were vague, others repeated information already known. None produced new evidence that could be verified independently. This process is common in missing person cases, where concern generates information but not always clarity. As weeks passed, the absence of results created a practical problem. Investigations required direction, and direction depends on evidence. Without a crime scene, without witnesses to violence, and without physical proof of wrongdoing, the case could not legally move forward in the way many expect from television portrayals of police work. The distinction between suspicion and proof became critical. Investigators may believe something has gone wrong, but belief is not enough to justify arrests or searches. Courts require probable cause supported by facts. In Zebb Quinn's case, those facts were limited. The investigation did not stop, but it slowed. Officers continued to review information already collected, looking for overlooked connections or inconsistencies. Nothing emerged that changed the legal standing of the case. Over time, active searches gave way to record maintenance and periodic review. This stage reflects a systemic challenge rather than individual failure. Missing person cases involving adults often exist in a narrow legal space. Until evidence shows that a crime has occurred, law enforcement authority remains restricted. Acting too aggressively without justification risks violating rights and jeopardizing any future prosecution. For Zebb's family, these limitations were difficult to accept. The absence of answers felt like inaction, even when work was being done within procedural boundaries. Each passing day reinforced the same uncertainty. There was no confirmation of safety, there was no confirmation of harm. As months turned into years, The case entered a state familiar to many unresolved disappearances. It remained open but inactive. The file was not closed. Zebb was not declared dead. His name stayed in databases and his disappearance stayed documented. What was missing during this period was not effort but evidence. The early investigation had reached the edge of what could be proven. Beyond that edge, action was no longer a matter of will but of law. Those early limits would define the case for decades, not because investigators stopped caring, but because the system requires facts before conclusions. And in the disappearance of Zebb Quinn, facts were scarce, silence was persistent, and time continued to move forward without answers. As time moved forward, the disappearance of Zebb Quinn did not fade in the way many unresolved cases do. It remained present within law enforcement records and within the memory of the community. Even as active investigations slowed, the case itself never closed. It stayed classified as a missing person file, preserved rather than abandoned. Within police departments, unresolved cases often survive through documentation rather than activity. Reports remain archived. Evidence, however limited, stays logged. Names connected to the last known movements are retained. In this case, the file continued to exist as a reference point rather than a working operation. Robert Jason Owens remained loosely associated with the disappearance during these years. His name appeared in the original investigative material. No charges followed, and no new evidence surfaced that would justify reopening the inquiry in a formal way. Still, the association was not erased. It lingered as an unresolved connection rather than an accusation. Cold cases rarely stay alive through a single factor. They persist through a combination of institutional memory, record-keeping, and unanswered questions that never fully settle. The disappearance of an 18-year-old without explanation fit that pattern. There was no confirmation of death. There was no confirmation of survival. The lack of resolution prevented closure. Media attention over the years played a limited but important role. Periodic reporting revisited the disappearance, often summarizing what was known and emphasizing what was not. These moments did not introduce new facts, but they prevented complete silence. The case resurfaced in public awareness without advancing legally. For investigators, the challenge was not forgetting the case, but justifying renewed action. Without new evidence, reopening an investigation risks repeating the same dead ends. Resources must be allocated where progress is possible. That reality placed the Quinn case in a holding state, neither active nor dismissed. The passage of time created additional obstacles. Physical evidence degrades or disappears. Witness memories fade. People move, change circumstances, or die. Each year that passed made the original moment harder to reconstruct with precision. Despite this, the file remained accessible. It was reviewed periodically. Details were preserved as accurately as possible. This maintenance mattered, even when it produced no immediate result. Cold cases often rely on consistency rather than urgency. Within the community, Zebb Quinn's disappearance became part of local memory. His name was recognized even by those who did not know him personally. The unanswered nature of the case gave it staying power. It represented uncertainty rather than resolution. For his family, the years without answers carried a different weight. There was no transition point from hope to acceptance. The absence of confirmation kept questions open. Time did not soften that uncertainty, it extended it. What kept the case from being forgotten entirely was not a breakthrough or discovery, but its incompleteness. There was no explanation that fit the facts, no conclusion that settled the matter. That lack of finality ensured the case remained present, even when inactive. This stage reflects how unresolved investigations exist over long periods. They are shaped less by action than by restraint. Law enforcement cannot advance without evidence. Families cannot move forward without answers. The case stays suspended between those two realities. Years passed without visible change, but beneath that stillness, the case remained intact, waiting not for time to heal it, but for circumstances to shift in a way that evidence could finally support. After years of inactivity, movement came from an unexpected direction. The change did not begin in Asheville or with new information from 2000. It began with a separate criminal investigation centered on Robert Jason Owens that forced authorities to look backward while moving forward. Owens became linked to a homicide case in Florida involving Adam Williams, a Food Network contestant. That investigation unfolded independently, with its own evidence, jurisdiction, and victims. Yet as detectives examined Owens' background, they encountered an unresolved disappearance that had never been explained. The name Zebb Quinn resurfaced, not as a footnote, but as an open question still sitting within official records. When law enforcement evaluates a suspect in a serious crime, prior associations are not ignored. Past contacts with missing persons, unresolved investigations, and earlier interviews are reviewed carefully. In Owens' history, the Quinn case stood out because it had never reached resolution and had never been formally closed. Authorities in North Carolina were notified as Owens came under intensified scrutiny. Investigators began reviewing the original missing person file with renewed attention. Reports from 2000 were re-examined, timelines were checked for consistency, interview notes were read again, not to reinterpret the past, but to determine whether information that once lacked context might now carry different weight. This renewed focus did not mean that evidence had suddenly improved. The same challenges remained. There was still no confirmed crime scene. No physical remains had been recovered. No forensic discovery had emerged from the original disappearance. What had changed was the legal environment surrounding a person long associated with the case. With that shift came procedural opportunity. Investigators sought judicial approval to take steps that had not previously met legal thresholds. Search warrants were requested for properties in Buncombe County connected to Owens. These requests were supported by accumulated records, historical associations, and the evolving investigative picture tied to the separate homicide case. The execution of those warrants marked a significant escalation. Searches were conducted by law enforcement following established protocols. Locations were documented. Materials were collected where permitted. Authorities did not immediately release detailed findings, reflecting both investigative caution and the need to preserve the integrity of any potential evidence. Public awareness followed quickly. For the first time in many years, the disappearance of Zebb Quinn returned to local and regional news, not as a retrospective summary, but as an active inquiry. The case was no longer frozen in time, it was moving again, even if the destination remained unclear. Investigators emphasized restraint in their public statements. They avoided outlining theories or projecting outcomes. This measured approach reflected the reality of reopening a case after decades. Assumptions can harden over time, and speculation can undermine legal progress. Each action had to be justified within the bounds of law and supported by verifiable information. The renewed investigation also required coordination across jurisdictions. Information flowed between agencies working on different cases involving the same individual. This exchange did not merge the investigations, but it allowed each to inform the other where appropriate. Patterns, timelines, and documented behavior were assessed carefully, rather than assumed. For the Quinn family, renewed activity brought complex emotions. The silence that had surrounded the disappearance for years was broken, but uncertainty remained. Movement did not guarantee answers, it only reopened the possibility that questions long left unresolved might finally be addressed. Within the Asheville community, the case regained attention. For some residents, it was a reminder of a disappearance they had never forgotten. For others, it was the first time they encountered the name. The renewed coverage highlighted how unresolved cases can remain present beneath the surface of a community's memory. What became clear during this stage was how cold cases sometimes re-emerge, not through discovery at the original scene, but through changes in circumstance. When a person connected to an unresolved disappearance becomes implicated elsewhere, old files gain new relevance. This shift did not solve the Quinn case. It did not provide explanations for what happened in January of 2000, but it altered the conditions under which the case existed. After years of procedural limits, investigators now had a lawful basis to reassess information that had long remained static. The disappearance of Zebb Quinn was no longer confined to the past. It had entered a new phase defined by renewed scrutiny, legal process, and the possibility that accountability, delayed but not dismissed, could finally be pursued through the system designed to deliver it. The renewed attention on the disappearance of Zebb Quinn moved from review to action through formal legal steps. After years of restraint shaped by limited evidence, investigators now had grounds to pursue measures that required judicial approval. Search warrants became the mechanism through which the case advanced. Authorities focused on properties in Buncombe County connected to Robert Jason Owens. These locations had existed within the background of the case for years, but had not previously met the threshold required for court-authorized searches. The warrants reflected a cumulative assessment rather than a single discovery. They were based on historical associations, investigative consistency, and developments tied to the separate homicide case that had brought Owens back into focus. The execution of these warrants followed standard procedure. Law enforcement documented each search carefully. Locations were secured, items were examined and collected where permitted. The process emphasized preservation rather than speed, recognizing the age of the case and the importance of evidentiary integrity. Public details about what was recovered remained limited. Authorities did not release comprehensive inventories or forensic findings at the time. That restraint was deliberate. In complex investigations, premature disclosure can compromise analysis or influence witness cooperation. The absence of immediate public answers did not indicate inactivity, it reflected caution. Alongside physical searches, investigators re-engaged with people connected to the original case. Interviews were revisited, statements from years earlier were reviewed for consistency. In some instances, individuals who had not spoken publicly before came forward with information they claimed to have withheld or not recognized as relevant at the time. These new statements varied in nature. Some involved recollections of conversations, others described observations or patterns of behavior. Investigators approached each carefully, aware that memory can be influenced by time, media coverage, and changing circumstances. Claims were assessed against existing records rather than accepted at face value. One challenge in cases reopened after decades is distinguishing between new information and reinterpretation of old facts. Investigators worked to corroborate statements where possible, comparing accounts with documented timelines and known movements. Reliability mattered as much as content. Throughout this process, law enforcement avoided framing conclusions publicly. Statements from officials emphasized investigation rather than resolution. The focus remained on gathering information that could withstand legal scrutiny, not on satisfying public curiosity. The renewed investigative activity signaled a shift in how the case was treated procedurally. While the absence of remains continued to limit certain avenues, The combination of circumstantial evidence, witness accounts, and historical context had reached a point where prosecutorial review became viable. Prosecutors began examining whether the accumulated material met the standards required for criminal charges. This assessment involved weighing the strength of evidence, the credibility of statements, and the risks inherent in pursuing a case without direct physical proof of a crime. Cases like this demand careful balance. Moving forward too aggressively can jeopardize a prosecution. Moving too cautiously can allow accountability to slip away. Each decision carries consequences. For the Quinn family, the renewed activity brought both visibility and restraint. Information emerged slowly, details were limited, yet the mere fact that warrants had been executed and statements re-evaluated marked progress after years of uncertainty. Within the community, attention intensified. News coverage tracked the procedural steps without offering speculation. The disappearance, long considered unsolved and inactive, was now being discussed as a case moving toward potential legal action. This phase highlighted how investigations evolve when time intersects with circumstance. Evidence does not always appear at once. Sometimes it accumulates quietly, gaining relevance only when viewed collectively. What once seemed insufficient in isolation can become meaningful in combination. Investigators remained mindful of the legal standards governing criminal cases. Suspicion alone does not justify charges. Evidence must be strong enough to persuade a court and ultimately a jury. Every step taken during this phase was guided by that requirement. As information continued to be gathered and reviewed, the case moved closer to a point that had once seemed unreachable. The disappearance of Zebb Quinn was no longer confined to review and reflection. It had entered a stage defined by active evidence evaluation and legal consideration. The path forward remained uncertain. Warrants and statements do not guarantee outcomes. They create opportunity rather than conclusion. But for the first time in decades, the case was advancing within a framework that allowed for accountability to be pursued rather than postponed. The renewed attention on the disappearance of Zebb Quinn moved from review to action through formal legal steps. After years of restraint shaped by limited evidence, investigators now had grounds to pursue measures that required judicial approval. Search warrants became the mechanism through which the case advanced. Authorities focused on properties in Buncombe County connected to Robert Jason Owens. These locations had existed within the background of the case for years, but had not previously met the threshold required for court-authorized searches. The warrants reflected a cumulative assessment rather than a single discovery. They were based on historical associations, investigative consistency, and developments tied to the separate homicide case that had brought Owens back into focus. The execution of these warrants followed standard procedure. Law enforcement documented each search carefully. Locations were secured, items were examined and collected where permitted. The process emphasized preservation rather than speed, recognizing the age of the case and the importance of evidentiary integrity. Public details about what was recovered remained limited. Authorities did not release comprehensive inventories or forensic findings at the time. That restraint was deliberate. In complex investigations, premature disclosure can compromise analysis or influence witness cooperation. The absence of immediate public answers did not indicate inactivity, it reflected caution. Alongside physical searches, investigators re-engaged with people connected to the original case. Interviews were revisited, statements from years earlier were reviewed for consistency. In some instances, individuals who had not spoken publicly before came forward with information they claimed to have withheld or not recognized as relevant at the time. These new statements varied in nature. Some involved recollections of conversations, others described observations or patterns of behavior. Investigators approached each carefully, aware that memory can be influenced by time, media coverage, and changing circumstances. Claims were assessed against existing records rather than accepted at face value. One challenge in cases reopened after decades is distinguishing between new information and reinterpretation of old facts. Investigators worked to corroborate statements where possible, comparing accounts with documented timelines and known movements. Reliability mattered as much as content. Throughout this process, law enforcement avoided framing conclusions publicly. Statements from officials emphasized investigation rather than resolution. The focus remained on gathering information that could withstand legal scrutiny, not on satisfying public curiosity. The renewed investigative activity signaled a shift in how the case was treated procedurally. While the absence of remains continued to limit certain avenues, the combination of circumstantial evidence, witness accounts, and historical context had reached a point where prosecutorial review became viable. Prosecutors began examining whether the accumulated material met the standards required for criminal charges. This assessment involved weighing the strength of evidence, the credibility of statements, and the risks inherent in pursuing a case without direct physical proof of the crime. Cases like this demand careful balance. Moving forward too aggressively can jeopardize a prosecution. Moving too cautiously can allow accountability to slip away. Each decision carries consequences. For the Quinn family, the renewed activity brought both visibility and restraint. Information emerged slowly, details were limited, yet the mere fact that warrants had been executed and statements re-evaluated marked progress after years of uncertainty. Within the community, attention intensified. News coverage tracked the procedural steps without offering speculation. The disappearance, long considered unsolved and inactive, was now being discussed as a case moving toward potential legal action. This phase highlighted how investigations evolve when time intersects with circumstance. Evidence does not always appear at once. Sometimes it accumulates quietly, gaining relevance only when viewed collectively. What once seemed insufficient in isolation can become meaningful in combination. Investigators remained mindful of the legal standards governing criminal cases. Suspicion alone does not justify charges. Evidence must be strong enough to persuade a court and ultimately a jury. Every step taken during this phase was guided by that requirement. As information continued to be gathered and reviewed, the case moved closer to a point that had once seemed unreachable. The disappearance of Zebb Quinn was no longer confined to review and reflection. It had entered a stage defined by active evidence evaluation and legal consideration. The path forward remained uncertain. Warrants and statements do not guarantee outcomes. They create opportunity rather than conclusion. But for the first time in decades, the case was advancing within a framework that allowed for accountability to be pursued, rather than postponed. As the case moved forward within the court system, attention shifted from investigation to legal strategy. Prosecutors and defense attorneys faced the same reality from different positions. The case was serious, the charge was severe, but the evidence carried limits that could not be ignored. Although Robert Jason Owens had been charged with first-degree murder, the absence of recovered remains remained a defining factor. Prosecutors had built their case on circumstantial evidence, historical records, and witness statements gathered over many years. While that body of information was substantial, it also carried risk if tested before a jury. In complex cases like this, legal outcomes are shaped not only by what may have happened, but by what can be proven beyond reasonable doubt. Prosecutors are required to assess whether a trial is likely to result in conviction, and whether that conviction would withstand appeal. Defense counsel evaluates the same evidence from the opposite direction. As proceedings continued, negotiations began. These discussions are a routine part of the criminal justice system, especially in cases where uncertainty exists on both sides. A plea agreement can provide certainty where trial outcomes remain unpredictable. Eventually, an agreement was reached. Owens pleaded guilty to lesser charges, including accessory after the fact in connection with Zebb Quinn's disappearance. The first-degree murder charge was dismissed as part of the agreement. This outcome reflected legal calculation rather than retreat. By securing a guilty plea, prosecutors ensured a formal acknowledgement of criminal involvement. The plea avoided the risk of acquittal that could have resulted from evidentiary challenges at trial. Accessory after the fact charges recognize participation in wrongdoing connected to a crime without requiring proof of committing the act itself. In this case, the plea established accountability within the limits of what could be proven conclusively. Owens was sentenced according to the terms of the agreement. The sentence carried significant consequences, though it did not equate to punishment for murder. The legal system responded with proportion based on charge and proof. For the Quinn family, the plea agreement delivered a complicated outcome. It provided a form of accountability after decades of waiting, but it did not answer every question. Some details remained unresolved. The absence of physical remains continued to leave gaps that no legal decision could fill. The community response reflected similar complexity. Many recognized the plea as a pragmatic resolution shaped by legal realities. Others struggled with the absence of a murder conviction after so many years. Both reactions reflected the emotional weight carried by unresolved loss. From a systemic perspective, the plea highlighted how the justice system manages long-delayed cases. Prosecutors must weigh the pursuit of maximum charges against the risk of losing the case entirely. Plea agreements can offer stability where trials offer uncertainty. Importantly, authorities avoided presenting the plea as closure in a broader sense. Public statements emphasized accountability rather than final answers. The outcome was framed as the most responsible resolution available under the evidence. This stage demonstrated how cold cases often conclude not with dramatic courtroom moments, but with negotiated outcomes shaped by legal standards. Justice in these circumstances is measured and constrained. The plea agreement closed the case procedurally, but it did not rewrite the past. It did not restore what was lost, or resolve every unanswered question. It marked the end of a legal process that had been delayed by time, evidence limits, and circumstance. After more than 20 years, the disappearance of Zebb Quinn reached a point where the system could act decisively, even if imperfectly. Accountability was achieved within the boundaries of law, shaped by proof rather than emotion, and defined by what could be established rather than what remained unknown. When the legal proceedings reached resolution, the impact extended beyond court records and sentencing documents. The disappearance of Zebb Quinn had remained part of the Asheville community for more than 2 decades, and the outcome reshaped how that absence was understood. For many residents, the case had never fully faded. Even as years passed without visible progress, the unanswered nature of the disappearance kept it present in local memory. The filing of charges and the later plea agreement shifted that long-standing uncertainty into a defined legal conclusion, even if it did not provide every answer. Public response reflected a range of reactions. Some viewed the outcome as long overdue accountability. Others struggled with the reality that the case concluded without a murder conviction. These reactions were shaped not by disagreement over facts, but by the emotional weight carried by unresolved loss and delayed justice. For the Quinn family, the conclusion marked an end to legal waiting, though not to questions. The case no longer existed in procedural limbo. Responsibility had been acknowledged within the bounds of the law, yet the absence of physical remains and complete explanations continued to leave gaps that the court system could not address. Law enforcement agencies involved in the case emphasized the importance of persistence and documentation. officials noted that long dormant cases depend on preserved records and institutional continuity. The ability to revisit the disappearance after decades relied on careful record-keeping rather than chance discovery. The case also renewed discussion around how missing person investigations are handled, particularly those involving young adults. Early classification decisions, evidence thresholds, and resource allocation were examined within the community, not as accusations, but as areas for learning and improvement. Media coverage during this period remained measured. Reporting focused on verified outcomes and legal context rather than speculation. This approach reflected an understanding that public trust depends on accuracy, especially in cases marked by years of uncertainty. Within broader conversations about cold cases, the Zebb Quinn investigation became an example of how accountability can emerge slowly. It demonstrated that unresolved cases do not disappear simply because time passes. They remain part of the system, waiting for circumstances that allow progress. Community members expressed renewed interest in unsolved cases closer to home. Awareness increased around the importance of reporting information, even years later. The case reinforced that details once considered insignificant may gain relevance over time. From an institutional perspective, the outcome highlighted the balance between action and restraint. Law enforcement and prosecutors operated within legal boundaries shaped by evidence and proof. The outcome reflected what could be established rather than what might be suspected. The disappearance of Zebb Quinn did not end with celebration or closure. It ended with acknowledgement. The system recognized responsibility without claiming certainty beyond what the evidence supported. In that restraint, the case offered a realistic picture of how justice functions in complex investigations. It moves carefully, it advances when permitted, and sometimes it resolves in a way that reflects limitations rather than absolutes. For the community, the case remained a reminder of both loss and persistence. Accountability arrived late, shaped by law rather than emotion. The outcome did not erase the years of waiting, but it affirmed that even after decades, unanswered cases can still reach a point of legal resolution, grounded in responsibility rather than speculation. The disappearance of Zebb Quinn and the long path toward accountability reveal how justice often unfolds slowly, shaped by evidence rather than urgency. This case did not progress in a straight line. It moved through pauses, limitations, and moments where action was not legally possible. Understanding that process matters because it reflects how the system functions when certainty is absent. One of the clearest lessons lies in the importance of early evidence. In the first days after Zebb vanished, the absence of a confirmed crime scene and physical proof restricted what investigators could do. Those early limits did not disappear with time. They followed the case for decades, influencing every decision that came later. When evidence is missing at the start, the consequences can extend far beyond the initial investigation. The case also shows how missing person investigations involving adults exist in a narrow legal space. Without clear signs of foul play, law enforcement authority remains constrained. This protects individual rights, but it also means that some cases cannot move forward until circumstances change. In this situation, progress came not from new discoveries at the original location, but from developments elsewhere that allowed old information to be reconsidered. Another lesson emerges from the role of persistence. The case did not survive because of constant activity. It survived because records were preserved, associations were documented, and the file remained accessible. Cold cases depend on continuity. When details are maintained accurately, they can regain relevance even after many years. The legal resolution highlights the difference between truth and proof. Many people may feel certain about what happened. Courts require more than belief. They require evidence that meets defined standards. The plea agreement reflected that reality. It secured accountability without claiming certainty beyond what could be established. That balance is central to a justice system built on restraint. This outcome also illustrates how plea agreements function in complex cases. They are not admissions of failure, they are tools used to manage risk, protect due process, and ensure some measure of responsibility when trials carry significant uncertainty. In long-delayed cases, they may represent the most responsible path available. For families of missing persons, the case underscores a difficult reality. Legal resolution does not always bring complete answers. It may offer acknowledgement rather than explanation. That distinction is important, even when it feels unsatisfying. The system can address responsibility. It cannot always restore clarity. From a community perspective, the case reinforces the value of attention without speculation. Media coverage that focused on verified facts helped maintain trust during renewed investigation. Public awareness played a role without distorting the process. That balance supports both accountability and fairness. There are also lessons for institutions. Coordination across jurisdictions mattered. Changes in circumstance created opportunity. The ability to act depended on communication and legal alignment rather than isolated effort. Cold cases often required that kind of convergence to move forward. Perhaps the most enduring lesson is that unresolved cases do not expire. Time can delay accountability, but it does not erase it. Files remain, names remain, and when conditions allow, the system can respond, even decades later. The disappearance of Zebb Quinn did not end with a complete explanation of events. It ended with a measured legal conclusion grounded in evidence, process, and restraint. That outcome reflects both the strength and the limits of the justice system. What this case teaches is not that justice is fast or complete, but that it is cautious, procedural, and persistent. And sometimes that persistence is the only path available toward accountability when certainty remains out of reach.